Battle of Gettysburg produced more than 50,000 casualties. The houses, the churches, all the buildings in Gettysburg seemed to be filled with them. To care for the wounded, the Union Army brought Major Henry James, an experienced surgeon, to oversee their care, and he came from Waterbury, Vermont. But what to do with the dead? The dead were everywhere. They lay on the slope of Little Round Top, where Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had launched his bayonet charge to save the Union line on the second day. They were all over Plum Run Valley, which suddenly gained the name the Valley of Death. They were in Devil's Den among the boulders and the rocks. They were all over the wheat field, where long lines of battle had stood at almost point-blank range on a hot July afternoon and slaughtered each other. The dead were everywhere. The Confederates were hastily buried in mass graves, but what about the Union soldiers? They were placed in individual graves, and most of their graves were marked with rude headboards. But what to do overall? The Gettysburg people addressed the problem. They formed a committee and they decided to create a national cemetery, and they wanted to put it on Cemetery Hill. It was approved, and a plan was made to dedicate the cemetery on the 19th of November, 1863. And to highlight the thing, they decided to invite to Gettysburg the most influential, famous orator in all of America, Edward Everett of Massachusetts, former president of Harvard and governor of the state. And then, as an afterthought, they decided it would be nice to have a few appropriate remarks from the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's staff at the White House wanted him to come to Gettysburg by train the morning of the event. But Lincoln said no, he'd go the day before on the 18th. He wanted to be sure he got here. The rails were going to be busy with special trains going to Gettysburg. This was a big event. Why was Lincoln so eager to be here? He didn't want to miss it because he had some things he wanted to say to the country. The war was not going well. Yes, there had been a victory of sorts at Gettysburg, but Lee's army had not been destroyed. Lee was back in Virginia on the loose. Lincoln knew the war would go into the next year. There was so much fighting and bloodshed ahead. There were some things he wanted to say. So he got here at 5 o'clock on the afternoon before the event. He was met here by David Wills, the Gettysburg lawyer, who was the moving force behind the cemetery. And Wells escorted him just up the street to the square where Wills's house stood, where Lincoln would spend the night. The day of the great event, Lincoln came in a procession from the Wills house out to the cemetery to the speaking platform, which was located at the top of the hill up beyond that fence. The cemetery was still under construction. There were open graves and they were keeping the crowds out. And what a crowd there was, probably 20,000 people, including many men who had fought here. Edward Everett spoke first, and he spoke for 2 hours, as he was expected to do, and he gave a magnificent report on what the battle had been all about, and he was careful to mention Stannard's Vermonters. A hush came over the crowd after the long applause for Everett, and then Lincoln walked to the speaker's stand with a few small papers in his hand. He looked out across the valley where all of this had happened, and he began to speak. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. And we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The applause for Lincoln went on and on. And then the 20,000 people went away, but really they have never stopped coming to Gettysburg, which has become the shrine of the American Civil War.
For a video copy of today's program, call toll-free 1-888-ATF-3430. Across the Fence is brought to you as a public service by University of Vermont Extension and WCAX-TV.